Okay. This is my 1984 Corvette C4. I've had this car for about 8 years now, and I've gotten it completely up and running myself. It was a complete mess when I got a hold of it, and I love this car. Beneath the hood is a 5.7-liter V8 L83 engine, mated with the Crossfire injection intake system. It makes a blistering 205 horsepower, and if the speedometer is to be believed, caps out at 85 miles an hour. Now, jokes aside, 205 horsepower isn't that bad, especially when considering this car is 40 years old. But the first C3 Corvette, released in 1968, rolled off the lot with a 5.4-liter V8 that was rated for 300 horsepower. And going all the way back to 1956, the Corvette C1 had a 210 horsepower, 4.3-liter V8 in it. 28 years of advancement, and we've seemed to have gone backwards. Why is that? So what led GM to make such an anemic, underpowered Corvette? Was it poor decision-making? Sabotage? Or was it all California's fault, as most things are? Or maybe all of the above? First, a small history lesson. This was the first year of this particular body style, where GM transitioned from the aggressive styling of the 60s and 70s C3s to a more sleek, modern, and in hindsight, very retro-futuristic design. And GM went all out. Power seats, power windows, power mirrors, power everything! A liquid crystal display dashboard gave that car the quintessential 80s feel, but like the cool 80s feel, not the I drive an AMC Eagle 80s feel. The rear hatch was the largest piece of glass on a production car in the US at the time, and the hood was a clamshell design, meaning when you lift the hood, damn near the whole top half of the car goes with it, creating a massive banner of "Come look at me" whenever you pop the hood at a car meet. Everything about this car makes a statement. So what the hell happened with the engine? Well, going all the way back to the mid to late 70s, GM was deciding what the new Corvette was going to be. The C3 style was starting to show its age, and the designers, headed by Dave McClellan, wanted to spice things up with something new and fresh. Modern technology certainly helped in this regard. They gave the C4 a stiff, unibody frame that combined the birdcage and frame assemblies of the 60s and 70s. High-grade steel construction and clever design allowed them to delete cross members from the frame entirely, letting them lower the entire cabin down and drop the roofline. The result of all of that work is the C4 design we see here, originally slated for a 1982 production year. But inevitable setbacks pushed them to the eventual 1984 production year that we see. Now all that was left was to settle on an engine. There was a lot of back and forth on whether the car should remain a front-engine, rear-drive car, or a mid-engine car with the engine mounted behind the seats and the cockpit pushed forward towards the front of the vehicle. Even the idea of a turbocharged V6 was floated around briefly. Ultimately, McClellan stuck with the front-engine, rear-drive, long-nose, short-tail V8 everyone knew and loved, convinced that it had not yet delivered everything it could. State-of-the-art for powertrains at the time was throttle body injection, a method which places one or two fuel injectors directly over a throttle body, spraying fuel straight into the intake manifold, where it's mixed with air before going into the cylinders to be ignited and create combustion, which runs the engine. However, GM did not have a throttle body assembly that provided enough air to run an engine like the L83 efficiently. So they just decided to use two. This would lead to another problem: hood clearance. They wanted a sleek and lower profile design for the C4, and two throttle bodies sitting in line on top of the intake would be simply too tall for the hood design the C4 was set to use. So they looked further back to the late 60s, specifically the Z28 Performance Model 1967 Camaro.
Camaro, fiery new creation from Chevrolet.
This Camaro was designed as a track-ready model for the SCCA Trans Am series and wasn't even listed in sales brochures as an option. Buyers simply had to be in the know to get their hands on one. The intake of the Z28 Performance Model Camaros was a pair of 4-barrel carburetors mounted diagonally across from each other, which created a much lower profile, low enough to meet the clearance needs of the C4 hood. But the Z28 Camaro was a dedicated race car, first and foremost. The cross-ram design led to pretty bad initial power and poor overall drivability in a day-to-day sense. Get it to over 3,000 RPMs though, and it transformed into a monster that ended up winning the SCCA Trans Am Trophy in 1969. But GM thought they could use the same general design, swap out the 4-bell carburetors for throttle body injectors, and it'd be serviceable as a street Corvette. They were dead wrong. The car had terrible throttle response and was practically undrivable at low speeds. The car was so bad that not only did it have a rough as hell idle that threatened to stall out at any moment, terrible responsiveness at low speeds, but it also had terrible emissions, which wasn't going to cut it as California was dropping new emissions laws left and right in the late 70s and early 80s. GM had to either meet these demands or simply not sell a Corvette in California. Thus, the many long nights of hammering out the design flaws in what was now being called the Crossfire injection system began. The biggest issue that was causing the Crossfire injection system to struggle so much during development were things that were fundamental to the design of the Cross-Ram, and thus the Crossfire itself. With the throttle bodies being in this offset cross configuration, it meant that they weren't close to the intake valves, meaning the air and fuel mixture had to travel through a runner, essentially a long metal tube, to reach the valves to do its job: explode. Due to the length and inner volume of the runners, the fuel would recondense if the air velocity dropped substantially, like by quickly opening the throttle bodies when you decide to slam the gas pedal to the floor. You need a proper fuel and air mixture to get ignition, so the fuel condensing out of the mixture was terrible news. How many times have I said terrible so far? It's going to continue. GM's eventual solution to this was to drastically narrow down the runners. This kept air velocity up high enough that even if you floored the pedal, enough of the fuel would stay a vapor to keep the engine running properly, and respond accordingly. This also happened to improve fuel economy, and as such kept it within the regulations that California had set. This, however, all restricts airflow, and as the RPMs of the car increases, the amount of air it needs also increases. So with the intake not being able to provide enough adequate air, the car had pretty terrible performance at high RPMs. But this was all good enough for GM, and they released the Crossfire injection system in 1982 in their C3 Corvette. Oh, God, getting out of here is going to suck in 10 years. What? 82? C3? Didn't I start this talking about the 84 C4? Well, backing up a little bit, remember when I briefly mentioned that there were a lot of setbacks during the C4's design? Well, that led to the CFI debuting on a C3 model, the final C3 model Corvette, that, if GM had their way, probably wouldn't exist at all. They wanted to debut the C4 and its new injection system in 1982, but since they couldn't, the recently refreshed in 1980 C3 was instead fitted with the new intake, mated up with the 5.7-liter V8 L83 engine, the exact same block that would end up in the 84 model. So now this is where we start to get into tinfoil hat territory. See, there's been a rumor going around for as long as the CFI has existed that the reason the 84 Corvette only makes 205 horsepower is due to intentional sabotage by GM. Why would they do this? Well, while throttle body injection was state-of-the-art during the design processes of the C4, in 1985, the C4 Corvette was released with not another Crossfire, but with a whole new system, referred to as tuned port injection. This new system replaced squirting fuel into throttle bodies with individual injectors squirting fuel into each port directly, which led to a better response time, better fuel economy, and, well, better everything, really. But this engine debuted in 1985, and we just got finished discussing how long it would take to put together the CFI, so how did GM come up with this TPI system in 1 year? Obviously, they didn't. By the time the CFI was introduced in 1982, the TPI system had to be well into development, but it clearly wouldn't be ready by 1982, or even by 1984. So the running theory is that since GM knew the system was on the way, they purposely hindered the performance of the Crossfire, so as to not risk overshadowing the upcoming tuned port injection system and harming potential sales. There is merit to the argument. The CFI is derived from the Cross-Ram, which, when working properly, was pushing up to 500 horsepower on the track. Like I said, it won the SCCA Trans Am in 1969. So surely, with proper work put into the design, the Crossfire could at least push at or near 300. This would dwarf the 250 horsepower that the TPI produced in '85, completely defeating the purpose of releasing this new system. This is also backed by modern mechanics and CFI enthusiasts pushing their CFI intakes to the max by porting the runners, reintroducing the higher airflow volume the car needs to perform well at high RPMs, replacing low PSI fuel systems with stronger ones that flow fuel at a higher rate, meeting the demand that the car needs. A lot of things point to GM purposely choking fuel and airflow to the engine to bring down performance. However, as we kind of already covered here, the mad numbers that the Z28 Camaro pushed came at the cost of all functionality that would make the car enjoyable to drive on the street. It was a race car, first and foremost, and it wasn't really built to do much else. So it could be said that the changes made were necessary to get a car that wasn't a nightmare to drive normally. And there was emissions regulations to consider, especially with California being stricter than the other 49 states when it came time to pass emissions regulations in the late 70s and early 80s. So really, it's a complete toss-up when it comes to the question of, did GM sabotage their engine? I personally lean more towards no, as all marketing for the 84 pushed hard that the car was a handling and performance vehicle first, speed demon second. Sure, it only had 205 horsepower, making it the quote-unquote slowest Corvette ever made. But the new suspension system and wide tires meant the car could take nearly 1 G of lateral force in a turn and not flip. Which means this thing can whip around turns at high speeds and love every second of it. It's honestly a lot of fun, ask me how I know. Weight balance was set so that the weight of the vehicle was evenly distributed across all 4 tires, rather than favoring front or back. This, paired with 4-disc brakes with the new at the time aluminum brake calipers, meant this thing could go from 70 to 0 in about 173 feet. Which, judging by my degree in Googling things, is incredible. So the main focus was handling and maneuverability over anything else, and if you've ever driven one of these, you probably noticed. It has an incredibly stiff suspension. My grandmother once said that if she wanted a comfortable ride in the Corvette, she'd be better off sitting on a skateboard tied to the back of it. Heck, the stiff suspension was such a common complaint with the 84 that in 85 they drastically softened it up to make it more comfortable. And despite everything we've just talked about, the 84 still had a respectable 6.7 second 0 to 60. It is still a Corvette. So why do I drive it? How do I feel about this quirky part of Corvette's history? Well, for one, it was given to me for free by my grandfather, and regardless of the year, it's kind of hard to pass up a free Corvette. But that aside, I adore this car. I spent many years getting it working after I got the keys, and just about everything I know about working on cars has been learned by working on this car. And there's a special kind of sentimentality that comes from that. It's also kind of a family heirloom. My great-grandfather bought the car in '84, and he eventually sold it to my grandfather, who then parked it after it got too difficult to climb in and out of the thing. Around 2016, I discovered the car, and it was gifted to me on the premise that I didn't let it sit and got it running again. But sentimentality aside, I absolutely adore this car.
It began as genius and grew to be legend, and has become at long last the most advanced production car on the planet.
You've never seen anything like this before.
A new Chevrolet Corvette like never before.
Never before.
I'm drawn to quirky, unorthodox, off-meta things, and the Crossfire and subsequently the C4 is all of those things. So I'm going to keep driving it and keep working on it for as long as I'm able. Whew, okay. So, I'm sure I've missed a lot about this car's history of the engine, the history of Chevy entirely. But I've never done a video like this. I'm actually kind of terrified to be in front of the camera right now. It took me all day to find a place that was completely empty, and as soon as one person showed up, I froze and just pretended I was staring at my phone, doing nothing. Yeah, I kind of feel like I'm an idiot out here in front of the camera, goofing around, pretending like my car matters at all. But anyway, if you like what you saw, please leave a like, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and definitely join the Discord where the RuneScape fans and car enthusiasts are actively going at war with each other. It's gonna be fun. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.